There are a lot of public speaking books. What makes this different is the call to share your voice and acknowledging that there are systemic biases that stand in the way, especially of folks who have historically been minoritized, but you need to speak anyway.
The target audience for us with the book was really less just women and more anybody who feels they aren't good enough or their voice isn't strong enough or nobody wants to hear what I have to say.
Hello and welcome to the show, an episode where we go deep on how to present yourself and maybe even fall in love with public speaking through finding your why, embracing your own unique voice and building a support community on your journey to public speaking success. But before we do that, I'd just like to call out a special free lightning lesson that I'm running with my co-conspirator and former podcast guest Saeed Khan on Tuesday the 15th of October. 5 ways to improve the B2B product sales relationship, where you can come along and hear how to present a united front with the sales team. Sign up and come along, or sign up and get the link to the recording. But whatever you do, go to b2bproduct.io/course and find out more. Check the show notes for more details. Anyway, enough of me. Let's go find out how to present yourself tonight on One Night in Product. So tonight my 2 guests are the returning to this podcast Christina Wodtke and first-time caller and hopefully not scared off by the end of it, Danielle Barnes. Christina's the renowned author of classic business fables like The Team That Managed Itself and Radical Focus, the thinking person's book about OKRs. And Danielle's a first-time, apparently reluctant author and one of the early employees at General Assembly. Between them, they've spearheaded Women Talk Design, a community and education platform aiming to increase the number of diverse speakers on stage. And they're here tonight to talk about their new book, Present Yourself, where they aim to help people become authentic and impactful public speakers. Christina, Danielle, how are you both doing tonight?
Yeah, Danielle here, and doing great. Thanks so much for having us.
And this is Christina, and I'm delighted to be back.
There you go. Most people, it's like Pringles. Once you've had one, you can't stop. First things first, I want to talk about Women Talk Design. So, Christina, I understand this was your initial idea and you got it started back in around about 2013. So what was the original goal of Women Talk Design and why did you feel compelled to get it started?
I had one of those moments where I'd seen yet another panel of 5 white guys talking about diversity or something equally annoying. And I was just like, what is the problem here, people? And I thought, well, I know tons and tons of amazing women speakers. So maybe I'll just start a blog. And every Friday I had a little note in my calendar saying, add a woman to the blog. I have a very, very full life. As you know, I'm a mom. I have a job. I write books. I have other jobs. I don't know. I just basically every square minute of my time has always been booked with something. So I thought 1 hour a week I could give to just adding a woman to this blog. And so I did it for a while. And as you know, there's tons and tons of lists of amazing women speakers out there. But one more. And then one summer, it was spring. We were coming up on summer. I had 2 of my A+ students. I was teaching at California College of the Arts. They did not have internships. I can't remember if it was the economics or possibly incompetence on the side of the art school I was teaching at. I went to art school, so I have a lot of affection for what they do and a lot of awareness of what they don't do well. But these students were kind of out of luck, so I thought, let me do a GoFundMe and I'll have them work on the blog. Well, bless my students, they were like, no, Christina, I did raise $40,000. I was able to pay for both of them, no problem. They told me, Christina, no, we're not going to work on the blog. We're going to do user research. We're going to go out and find out what the real problem is. And what they found is, okay, yes, people forget to put women on stage lineups, but a lot of times they find one woman and she's like, oh no, I can't, or I'm busy, and here's a male colleague who can step in front of me. And they really made a great argument of helping women feel a lot more comfortable speaking on stage. I feel like Danielle could talk about this a lot better because she really dug into the research, and she's the one who took my silly little blog and turned it into a real business.
Well, that was going to be my next question, actually. So my next question was about kind of obviously Danielle coming on board, because now the CEO of Women Talk Design, and I think you started around about 2017. So kind of passing the torch from Christina then, like, how did you get involved? I mean, I don't know if that was kind of covered in Christina's bit just then, like you were one of the people, but like, how did you get involved and what, or how did that then evolve the company as well?
Yeah. Christina and I have been friends for many years, actually back at General Assembly. She was our first user experience design instructor, and I was her producer working behind the scenes to make it happen. And we had stayed in touch over the years. And so when she was running the GoFundMe campaign, one of the amazing things that happened is there were individuals, but also organizations and companies that reached out and were like, we want to support. We see the problem that you're talking about, and like, we don't know how to fix it. So let me give you money in order to help fix this. And Christina realized that there was so much more that could happen with Women Talk Design because of the funding that was coming through, because of the really important research that Jennifer and Melissa came up with and discovered. And as Christina shared, she has a very full life. She's very busy and said to me, like, I know that this could be something more and I don't have the capacity to do it. And could you help, make this something more, make it what it could be? Which started off initially as our very first workshop. This was what ultimately became Present Yourself. It was one of the rewards that was promised through the GoFundMe. So that was the first order of business. As Christina's like, we just need to make this happen. We have to teach this first workshop. I promised it. But then ultimately it was, could this be something more? Could we take these insights that Jennifer and Melissa had and really make an impact? And so I decided to incorporate it as a social enterprise using the model of, okay, if we have all these people that want to give, can we use B2B funding and revenue in order to fund free and low cost community programs? And it's really kind of taken off from there over the past almost 7 years. We've done a mix of a lot of community public speaking programs and trainings. We've created some resources to give to event organizers on how they can design more inclusive events that speakers actually want to be a part of. And we've worked with companies in order to not just give sponsorship, but to also train their teams. And Women Talk Design's mission has really expanded from, how can we get more women on stage to how can we help really amplify the voices of women and non-binary folks and make sure that they can get their ideas out there and that they're heard.
So you've solved it. That's the most important thing. You've solved it all. It's all okay. We can all go home now and everything's fixed. Is that like how, maybe one day.
I think what's really important when you try to take on incredibly large, ridiculous, complex, systemic problems is you have to find the bite-sized piece. What's the old saying? How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. We just decided that we would take a bite out of the ear maybe and just work on that one corner of what Melissa and Jennifer found is that a lot of women don't feel comfortable promoting themselves. And even I on this, when you asked me, oh, how did it get started? I was like, Danielle tells it better. I don't want to be braggy. Like there's a lot of cultural programming in our heads that we carry around, no matter how fiercely feminist we are. My mom was a feminist. My dad was a feminist. I was raised feminist. And I'm still like, oh, don't look at me sometimes. And so giving women these tools to find their voice, to feel confident in their story, to see the value. And then, of course, the community, that was built up about it also is amazing because women are fabulous advocates of each other, even if sometimes it's hard to advocate for ourselves. So Women Talk Design just took that research and really fleshed it out into something that was powerful for so many women's lives.
But still so much work to do. Not solved.
Still a lot of elephant left for dinner.
Well, one of the bites of the elephant that you've also taken, as mentioned in the intro, and the kind of the main thrust of what we'll be talking about today is the book, Present Yourself, Proven Strategies for Authentic and Impactful Public Speaking. So lots of great sounding words there, but if you had to elevator pitch that book, what would the elevator pitch be? And I guess who is the principal audience for the book itself?
I think there are so many public speaking books out there. And this is actually what we start with saying is like, there are a lot of public speaking books. What makes this different is the call to share your voice and acknowledging that there are systemic biases that stand in the way, especially of folks who have historically been minoritized, but you need to speak anyway. To give you a lot of different tools and strategies, because one of the things that we're trying to share is that there's no one right way to speak. And I think like that is such a big part of the value prop of this book is that we're telling you like, you don't have to change who you are to be an effective public speaker. Instead, we want to give you a menu of options of things that you can do. And this is, part of what was built into the book by bringing in all these different contributors. We have, in addition to Christina and I's experience, 11 different speakers who shared their stories and their advice. And so, we have a really powerful framework in here, the CAMP framework that Christina created and used for designing anything. We apply it to presentations, but also within that, so many different strategies and tools, and saying, this is for you to be able to carve your own path, because again, your voice needs to be heard and we want you to do it your way.
The target audience for us with the book was really less just women and more anybody who feels they aren't good enough, or their voice isn't strong enough, or nobody wants to hear what I have to say. And I think that's a voice of a lot of people. I grew up nerdy in Iowa in the 80s. And back then, geeks and nerds were like, we just get beaten up. If you remember the 80s movies, that's kind of how it felt like. And so I think that there's a lot of people who have a lot of reasons to feel like their voice isn't good enough. Maybe you're dyslexic. It could be invisible. It could be social anxiety. It could be, you can have social anxiety and stand on stage and give a talk. Introverts can do it too. So anybody who's like, I have something to say, but I don't know if anybody will ever listen, the book is a tool to let you do that, to find my way of speaking, my style, my story, and get that confidence that you need to stand up on stage or in a boardroom. Danielle always likes to remind me that this is incredibly important for your professional development as well.
I'm so glad Christina called out that broader audience that we have, because, Present Yourself, the program we have, we still run it actually as an 8-week course. And that's really specifically designed for women and non-binary folks. And with this book, we wanted to say, okay, well, these lessons aren't exclusive to those groups, right? Like, so many other people could benefit from these lessons. We actually, in corporate settings or different other events that we've done, we've had it open to all genders, and other people have also gained a lot from this. And so, that was one of the reasons we really wanted this book to exist, is to further access to these lessons.
So just to clarify then, there's plenty in this book for the historically underprivileged, middle-aged, white, cisgender, straight guys like me. They can still read this book as well.
Hey, everybody's got some kind of mountain they're trying to climb. Everybody's got some kind of hole they're trying to dig out of. I feel, as somebody who has non-visible disabilities and a service dog, that judging is just a waste of your time. And I like to think that this book is good for anybody who's been afraid to step up and speak, honestly.
But a certain type of social media character that I can definitely think of, and I'm sure that you can think of too, might listen to either this bit or the bit around, the organization in general around Women Talk Design. And they might sit there and say something along the lines of blah, blah, boo hiss, DEI, blah, blah, meritocracy, blah, blah, what about me? And it seems like there's a rather large number of those types of people in tech circles. I'm assuming that you've both had to put up with that narrative yourself in the past. I'm sure that many of your community members are putting up with that as, right now. I guess my only real question to this point is, have you found a reliable way of shutting those people up?
Show them the back of your head, walk away. I don't know. Can you shut them up? Is there a mute button? I really find that people who love to hear the sound of their own voice always have an audience.
I've also found I hate that this even makes us fortunate, right? But we've been pretty fortunate, as to knock on wood, have had just so much support surrounding Women Talk Design. I know people in our community have witnessed that type of hateful speech and discrimination. And I feel really lucky that as a community, as a platform, we have not been targeted. I feel like now just saying this, I'm opening us up to this, but I think too, it's so many of the speakers that have now started to share their voice after going through Women Talk Design programs or being through these community, just have such amazing things to say. And so there's just going to be awful people out. I mean, this is one of the things we share, even in talking about Q&A. One of the fears that folks, especially women, have when it comes to doing a Q&A session at a conference is well, what about that asshole who's going to just try to disprove everything I say, who is really just giving comments and not questions and trying to show me up. It's one of the things we say is those people will exist and we'll talk about how to handle them. But for the most part, people are there to cheer you on. Like overall, people are there to see you. They want you to succeed. And I think starting from that place of who are all my supporters, and then like, yes, there are real tactics that you need to address the people who are there to tear you down. But I do think that there are so many people out there that we have been really lucky to be cheering the work that Women Talk Design on has been doing.
And there's a big difference between Q&A, where you have somebody who's maybe holding forth at great length, and we give you practical tools like, I'm sorry, I see there's a long line for questions. Could you please set aside and I'll talk to you over in the reception, or, nudge them into something that's a little less performative. We've got those classic tools, but it's a very different story when you talk about, rather than Q&A problems, QAnon type problems, where we have people who are actually going after you and looking to swat you or something. And that's a real thing, but it's really also very, very uncommon. And being aware of it, I don't know if you can ever be ready for it. Being aware of it is one thing, but if it stops you from speaking, then they're winning. And so we recommend, speak at conferences that have a code of conduct. Find out, ask the conference organizers, how do you plan to deal with it if somebody violates this code of conduct? You want to try, if you're nervous about this, if you're talking to a group that you're anxious about, like say hardcore gamers, then making sure that you're going into a situation where the people who are running the conference have your back to a certain degree is really important as well. We live in a weird connected world, and everybody gets to decide their own level of comfort in navigating that world. But like I said, it's not as common as you might think. And if the organizers have your back, you'll probably be okay. I hope. I don't know.
Fingers crossed.
I want to be positive, but I got to say that's always sort of grim. It's so grim.
It's this hard tension. I mean, this was a piece on the book that I think we might have spent the longest time on, is like, how do we strike this balance between wanting to be really honest about the risks of speaking, especially for women and other folks who have been historically attacked, but also like not have that be a silencing tool, and to really emphasize how important it is to have your voice be heard. And so like, yes, understanding your own tolerance for risk, and then also doing what you can to ensure safety, like Christina talked about, of speaking at places where there's a code of conduct, it's enforced, and all of that. But it's a tension that exists.
But I saw a post on X, if we have to call it that, recently by Molly White, who said that at a recent Bitcoin conference, there were more speakers named Rob, Matt, Mike, Chris, Alex, or Brian than female speakers in total. Now, I've got some vague recollections in my head of some conferences even inventing female speakers to make the roster look a little bit better, and then someone did a little bit of research and found out that those people didn't exist. So broadly speaking, what is the situation out there at the moment in this day and age if you're not someone who looks like me and you're trying to get on stage and give that big talk in front of a big crowd? Is it getting better? Is it the same? Is it getting worse in the kind of under the onslaught of these Brians and Alexes out there that are trying to take over? Like, how is the kind of the trend?
We have worked a lot with specifically like design and product conference organizers. And I think in that space, anecdotally, it has improved in terms of the diversity on stage. Like I've been pleasantly surprised and happy to see that. I think as a whole, like I haven't looked at the data recently to see in conferences more broadly if it's improved. I do know that like historically, and continues to happen, like when there's new technology, right, it tends to be seen as like, okay, this is a lot of like white bros who are leading the charge in this technology. And so like they're the ones that are getting asked to speak at these conferences. And I even spoke to a white woman VC who was like, I'm trying to invest in crypto and I like can't find women in crypto, right? Like I go to these events and they're all men in crypto. I'm like, there are women in crypto. Like, let me like pull up on our directory where they are, right? So I think that it's like sometimes it feels like yes, and then sometimes, especially with emerging technologies, even though there are some really incredible folks that are not white men that are doing work on that topic, I think it like often defaults to, okay, who are these people with privilege and power that are kicking off these conferences?
I think, and I'm a little bit older than Danielle, I have 20 years on you, that it's gotten significantly better. And what I've seen that's been really powerful is organizers that are actually actively bragging about their diversity. Like I've had organizers, say to me, I got 50% women, or I've got this, 30% people of color. Like I sort of find the metrics thinking little weird, but on the other hand, if it's making a difference and it's a point of bragging and people are being public about it, like, look at my lineup, folks. This is an awesome lineup. Look at these amazing people you've never heard from who are terrific. One of the struggles we had when we first started with the workshops that came out of the research, actually came out of Melissa and Jennifer's research, was that a lot of conference folks are scared of losing money, right? And so one of the things that they really struggle with is this speaker going to be good? And so one of the things that we did with our workshop that was very different was make sure that people got professional photos and recordings of a 5-minute talk, a video of that. And thinking about conference organizers, how we reduce their risk really helps tremendously. So I would definitely recommend to any speakers out there that once you put together a talk, Margaret Bloomstein is a huge fan of taking a selfie in the bathroom with a good light with your phone slightly above you. I think she's tweeted about it. It's in the book. And then, you can do a 5-minute Zoom now. Everybody has Zoom. You can Zoom into the ether and pretend you're having a giant webcast or something and give a 5-minute talk. But really, the easier it is for a conference person not just find you, but have faith in you, the easier it becomes to have a diverse lineup. And we're seeing it. I think we're seeing that change. But as Danielle says, we're in the tech UX product. I touch engineering a little bit through my OKR Agile work. The rest of the world is the rest of the world. It varies.
So when you're talking about, like, to some extent there, about what people are expecting from a speaker, like, they want someone good. They have this image in their mind of what someone good looks like, and hopefully that image is changing, and certainly in some cases it seems like it is. But one of the things you talk about in the book is about how to break the stereotype of what makes a good speaker. And I think of some of the books that I've read about public speaking before this, and obviously you called out that there's a bunch of them. Won't name them and give them oxygen on your podcast, but at the same time, there are lots of books out there that have these very specific views on what good speakers look like and what good speaking looks like. Are there any outdated stereotypes that you'd like to throw in the bin about what a good speaker looks like?
Ooh, that's an interesting one. I have noticed VCs and CEOs are everybody's favorite speaker. And it's funny because they're not always interesting. They have all the same stories to tell as everybody else. Nothing personal against the, John Doerrs and Mark Zuckerbergs of the world. Like, you want the big name, but sometimes they're CEO of a little tiny something or another, or a small VC firm, but they have those magic letters behind them. And they aren't always the ones that have this incredible story. And I studied story quite extensively when I went to write Radical Focus, and it's something that is built into the present yourself approach. Storytelling is at the very heart of how we teach how to give a talk. And they don't always have the best stories, and the best stories have struggle. You got to have struggle. You got to have an enemy. You've got to have a sense of overcoming. And it's like, oh yeah, I graduated from Stanford GSB, and then I got a job at Andreessen Horowitz, and yeah, that was good, And I actually had a student at Stanford, come up to me and love the speaker series I put together, which was incredibly diverse, all these wild stories, almost all women. I had a token white man. Sorry about that, but there we are. But she goes, because she said the stories we hear at Stanford is all these people coming back going, oh yeah, I graduated and then I immediately raised $5 million and I had a startup, and yeah, that worked out well. And those are boring stories. They're short and they're not interesting. So I think you got to ask yourself, like, who's doing something weird despite the fact that the odds are against them? Who's fighting and standing up hard and still at it, Who's the person who wasn't handed buckets of money and said, go make something? Those are the people I think that are going to be much more interesting speakers.
I also think in terms of what might be unexpected, I think oftentimes we think of a good speaker as, someone who has really great like modulation when they speak and uses a lot of arm movements and, can bring this kind of grandeur to their talks. And I do think those speakers can be really engaging, but I've also seen speakers who are a little bit more reserved and who, speak in a lower tone or who speak more slowly or who don't move around on stage. I've actually given the example a lot of Susan Fowler, who ousted Uber for all their discrimination. She came on stage at South by Southwest in like 2018, 19, and she walked on stage carrying a script and said, I'm terrified of public speaking. There are thousands of people here, and I might black out and start telling Seinfeld jokes. And my story is too important. And so I have my notes here with me to make sure that you can hear my story. And she read from a script. And like normally when we think about public speaking, it's like, no, you can't read through a script from a script. Like that is, it's boring and the audience won't feel like you're engaged with them. And yes, there are some challenges of using a script. Like it's something we talk about the pros and cons of it. But I think that ultimately, like different speakers need different things in order to show up and really be able to share their story. And like what Christina said, the story is what's most important. And I think that is one of the things that I really want to get through with the book is that your presence is important, but your presence doesn't mean that you are this, certain type of like TED speaker who's moving around the stage in a certain way and like, speaking in a certain tone and using all these gestures. Like those can be great, but it doesn't mean everyone needs to do them.
That's something I'm really proud of in the book is this idea that there are no rules. There's lots of things you can try on and see if they work for you. And one of my favorite speakers, John McWhorter, who's a linguist who teaches at Harvard and a Black man, and he just gets on stage, on TED stage, and he plants his feet and he doesn't move. I swear to God, he is glued to a single moment. But his voice is just such a fascinating storyteller that I could just close my eyes and be in this world that he paints for it. So I think leaning into your strengths and leaning into what makes you comfortable is what it's about. I think that's Danielle is so spot on.
It's funny actually because there's one book that I read, which I guess I have to call out, which is The Presentation Secrets of Steve Jobs, which is, a decent enough book. And obviously Steve Jobs was one of those alpha white guys that, everyone wants to basically be, or quite a lot of people want to be. And they kind of contrasted his style, which was obviously super well practiced and super well nailed down, with, I think it was the Singular CEO, the kind of the cell carrier that the iPhone was originally going to go out on, who kind of came on again with like a bunch of cards and was kind of relatively reserved. But at the same time, like they almost contrasted it like that was an awful presentation. I don't know if either of you remember it, but like I watched it after that because I was like, oh, how bad could it have been? And it was actually fine. Like he said all the right things. He was genial. He wasn't that much of a story, I guess. He was being quite matter of fact. But I guess there's just, it kind of almost feels like Steve Jobs and Steve Jobs' kind of ilk that have followed they've really reinforced this idea that there's this one way to be an amazing presenter. And it just feels a real shame because if I'm not a good speaker, but if I'm not a good speaker, then that's almost an impossible standard to want to aspire to from step one, right?
I mean, I would say even before that, starting with Dale Carnegie wrote like the original public speaking book that everyone saw. Like the guy who had to make friends and influence people, right? Like that's the type of speaker I need to be. And I do want to call out that there are a lot of really great public speaking books out there. And we actually reference a lot of them in our book and give them credit for what they've taught us. And so I do want to highlight that. But I think that, this idea has been kind of ingrained in society of like, this is what this public speaker looks like. And as Christina shared earlier, it might make people feel, especially someone who maybe is introverted or more quiet or shy, think, oh, then like I I shouldn't be speaking because like I can't be like that. And like I've tried, I've practiced, that's not who I am. And that's just not the case.
But that stereotype about extroverts and introverts is an interesting one as well. This idea that you've got a natural advantage if you are that, as sort of described earlier, you kind of go up and do the jazz hands and do lots of really exciting things with your voice and all of the things that I try to do because, I don't want people to get bored of listening to me on all of the podcast episodes that I've done. But, at the same time, I definitely classify myself historically and somewhat these days as an introvert myself, and definitely don't find it natural to get out and do these sorts of things. It's something that I have to work at. But you've obviously both worked with a lot of people, presumably including many introverts, on trying to do this sort of thing. So is there like an easy, I say easy, but like, is there a way for or like a framework or a step-by-step plan to get introverts that may feel like getting up on stage is like the worst thing in the world that they would never want to do, but to actually get them comfortable with that and maybe even get them to, almost like fall in love with public speaking?
One of the first parts of the book that I think is important for everyone, regardless of how you identify, is to get really clear on your why and the reason that you want to speak. And this is, I think, what can help anyone fall in love with public speaking is having that deep-seated, this is why I want to do this. And one of the reasons that's come up a lot, actually, as we've worked with different speakers, there's so many different reasons to speak. I want to sell my business. I want to grow in my career professionally. One that has come up a lot is I want to find my people and I want to be able to connect with other people who care about the things that I do. And I've spoken to folks who don't like to attend conferences because it's hard to go up to people you don't know and start talking to them and figure out, like, do we have these things in common? And something that I've heard from speakers that we've worked with is that when you speak on a topic, people who are your people come to you and say, oh, Christina, oh, Jason, like you talked about this topic. I would love to talk to you more about it. And it's such a great way to form connection with people, especially for folks who aren't as comfortable or like don't thrive in the areas of going up into big crowds. And so that I think is, again, an important starting place for everyone is your why. But I do think tapping into, that why, especially as it relates to how you want to connect to people and use that can be helpful for folks who may not view themselves as extroverted and think that speaking is for that.
Nobody ever believes I'm an introvert, but I am completely exhausted by human contact, even though I'm super curious and interested in human beings. And I will say that I never have fallen in love with public speaking. I am insanely in love with what it enables, and that's speaking to Danielle's why. I love that I find other people who care. I teach, which is public speaking every day, which if you don't like public speaking, teaching will definitely, it's exposure therapy. If you have to teach a class, eventually you're just like, I can't be freaking out every single time I teach. This is too exhausting. So you get comfortable with it. You get used to it. But the goodies is when somebody's like, oh, this thing that you talked about, I did it and it made things better. That for me is always going to be my why. And so anybody who has a secret, something they figured out, an insight, those are all great things to share out because then you can help other people. So, and I want to be really honest, it will change your financial life. Being able to speak will let you in your company be more visible. It will mark you as a smart person. It will help you get promoted outside of your company, speaking on stage. It will increase your rates. It'll find you clients. I mean, we live in a world where we have to make money. And guess what? Being able to speak will help you make money, even if you aren't just a wacky consultant who's off, talking about this cool methodology on a stage. Even if you're just, Jill in customer service, being able to talk about the importance of the struggles customer service has will get you more hires, will get you money for your team, and get you that promotion potentially. So I think it's just like a basic human skill that's worth having that you do not get taught in high school or even college sometimes. And it's vital.
But there is an interesting point there about what you raised about, Jill from CS, for example, because I get people from time to time asking me, like, how can I be more present in the community? How can I have more, not me, them? How can they have more of a voice? How can they build their network? How can they get up, maybe not get on stage, but like, how can they maybe do content work or something like that, start sharing their perspectives and all of the stuff that is, very similar, at least philosophically, with the stuff that you're talking about. But a lot of people worry that no one's really going to be interested in what they've got to say, or that their perspective doesn't matter, or that it's all been said before by someone else that's way more credible than them. Now, I know what I say to those people, but do you think that they should do it anyway, or do you feel that there are certain things that they need to think about before they commit to something like this?
I definitely think they should do it anyway, but here's why. So I write books, right? This was my 5th book, which was exciting. If you're an author, going into a bookstore or library is soul crushing, because you just go, oh my God, there are so many books. There are so many books. How is anybody ever going to read my silly little book? Is anybody going to pay attention to it? And some of my books have not found a big audience at all. But they've found a passionate small audience that's written to me. And they've said, this book, I love this book. I mean, Pencil Me In did not do as well as I'd hoped it was. I worked hard on it. It was an act of love. And yes, Teresa Torres is like, oh my God, I love this book. I make all my students read it. It really resonated. And a long time ago, in the first South by Southwest that ever had game people, Jesse Schell, who's like a huge, like massive figure in game design world, was giving a talk. And if he'd been giving that talk at the Game Developers Conference, it would have been 1,000 people in the room. And he tweets out, there are only 8 people in this room, but I think they are the right 8 people. And every time I sit down to write a book, I'm like, if the right 8 people read this, it will be okay. The people who really need it, the people who will be touched by it. And so I think that's part of it. Also, being a writer is you suck a lot. Your writing sucks. You just got to keep doing it and keep doing it, edit it and get better and do it. I've been blogging since 2000. My early blog posts are not works of genius by any means. I have a couple good days now that I've been doing it for, 24 years. Wow, there's today's thought. But you got to do it. You got to keep doing it. You have to suck. You have to look at it and go, how could this be better? And you have to be willing to find some audience, even if it's only 8 people. And that's my advice for getting past that. There's so much stuff out there. The library problem, I call it.
Yeah, it's funny as well because, and again, maybe more from a content perspective than a speaking perspective, because speaking is very obvious who's watching or who's not. And I remember back in the old days when I was still a struggling wannabe musician going out there on stage, and you could see like the 8 people in the room, you could see exactly who hated you and who didn't. So there's this kind of public vulnerability that you have when you're going up on stage, because you can see who's paying attention and you can see who's not paying attention and who's leaving early and stuff like that. So I guess, but it is interesting at that point about the right people. And this is something I say to people with content as well, like when they're just cranking stuff out to feed the LinkedIn algorithms. It's like, and even with podcasts as well, actually, like this idea that, well, oh, my podcast episode's only got a few hundred listens or whatever. It's like, yeah, but imagine if you were like presenting to 200 people. Like 200 people is like 10 times the size, well, maybe not 10 times, but certainly a number of times the size of the village I grew up in as a kid. Like, imagine talking to a room full of that many people. You don't have to imagine it if you're actually talking to them, but just this idea that like you're still making a difference to some people. And like the big changes in the world, like not everyone can be Steve Jobs, but at the same time, if you can be Steve Jobs to someone, then that's still a benefit, right?
I echo so much of what Christina shared. And this is a question that we get a concern, I guess we get a lot. We actually teach a workshop called Design Your Talk Topic, and we created a guide around it and incorporated it into the book that answers this question of what should I speak about, right? And these questions come up all the time of, well, what do I have to share? Who cares what I have to say? I'm not an expert in this. Someone else has spoken about it. And there's a lot of different responses we have to that. I think that one of the things we really try to emphasize is about your audience, which, Christina talked a lot about, right? Like you find your audience and it might be big or small, depending on what the topic is, but they're there and they're people that care about what you have to say. And also, I feel strongly that if other people are talking about a topic, it probably means that people need to hear it, right? Like if someone's talking about a topic, because it's important. It's because maybe the change hasn't happened that you all want to see in the world. And you're going to add your own perspective to that. Even if you don't feel like you have anything new, your way of seeing the world or your stories or the way in which you encountered this topic, this problem in the first place is going to be different than someone else talking about it. And so you will have that perspective to share. And that's going to resonate with someone that maybe it might not have resonated if they heard it from someone else. And so that's something that we really like to remind people too.
Yeah, it reminds me of stories that I've heard from people out in the community about, like, you know, if they're a young female Black product manager that's having these experiences for the first time, that sometimes it's nice to hear from the young female Black product manager that's just a bit ahead of them in their career and has basically suffered through all of the same problems that they have in almost exactly the same context that they've had, rather than just listening to some 150,000 follower LinkedIn guru talking about the stuff instead. So I think it is interesting, this whole point about finding your people. And it feels to me, and hopefully you agree, that everyone's got their people, right? There's always someone that can benefit from your perspective on stuff.
Oh, and Danielle, you should share Denise Jacobs' story.
Oh, so good. So Denise Jacobs, keynote speaker, author of Banish Your Inner Critic, she and Christina did a talk for the Women Talk Design community. And she shared with us her journey into public speaking. And she talked about, I think we include a clip of it in a quote of it in the book.
Yep.
And she shares that she went to, I think it was Web Visions in Portland, if I'm remembering the details correctly, in the early 2000s. And she attended the conference and she talked about how there are all these big name male speakers, Matt Mullenweg and BJ Fogg. And ultimately it was Molly Hirschlag. What's her name?
Yes. Molly Hirschlag. I was blanking on her name too. Yeah.
Molly Hirschlag, rest in peace, who has passed since then. But she attended the conference and saw Molly speak. And she was like, Molly was who I came to speak and who I wanted to speak from here. And there were all these other big, famous white men. And she said, when I heard Molly speak, something hit differently because she was talking about the topics that I was interested in. She was even telling the types of jokes that I would normally tell. And all these people were cheering her on. And Denise said, I had this moment that if Molly's doing this, then I can do this too. This could be me. And seeing this other woman on stage. And now, Denise now is a very well-known, high-paid keynote speaker. And I think it really speaks to this idea of being able to see someone or hear from someone who has similar experiences to you and how much of a difference that can make.
I love the way Danielle tells it. If you can't have Denise, you can always have Danielle, at least to have that story, because that's very much what we have at Women Talk Design. We've always had this persona, and she changes a lot. She's either a woman or she's non-binary, and they're sitting in the audience, and maybe they're Hispanic, or maybe they're Black, or maybe they're disabled, or maybe they're, just they're different from whoever's on stage. And they're sitting there going, oh God, this isn't for me. Maybe I shouldn't even belong in this industry. And then they see somebody on stage and they share an element of that identity. And maybe it's a woman, or maybe they make similar jokes, I guess. But they say that they could be me, right? That moment, it could be me. And we believe very much that if you could see it, you start thinking, maybe I could be it. And I just think that sometimes if you can just be that person who's brave enough to go on stage, you can talk about the same thing everybody else is talking about. I wrote a book about teams. I talk about teams. Everybody friggin' talks about teams. But maybe if I admit I'm dyslexic, if I take off my shoes, I'm a woman, I have all these identity elements, that maybe somebody in the audience will say, well, maybe I will stand up and talk about something I care about as well. And maybe I'll have a weird, quirky little view on it, which is why I talk about teams, because I think I do have a different point of view about it. And I think having those tools makes such a big difference to your confidence. So knowing, I can use a story, and if I do these paces to the story, people will get engaged. Our human beings are wired for stories. So we put all these tips in here so that you can get this toolbox that makes you feel more confident, that makes you more successful, that will up your likelihood of connecting. And maybe you'll become Denise Jacobs one day. It's possible. She did it. You can do it. Well, she's a badass. We're not all quite as badass as Denise.
She also has like this great call at the end when she tells the story. And she's like, I just want you to know you are needed on stage. I don't care how experienced you think you are. Everything you've done up until this point, you can help someone who hasn't done all of those things that you have done. And so like, you need to share your story. And I think at the end of that, Christina was like, yes, yes, yes. And I was like crying.
Yeah.
We're like, it was like the perfect summary and story to why we do the work we do at Women Talk.
Yeah. Look her up and watch one of her talks. You will get a shot of courage. She's a terrific speaker.
Absolutely, I will do that. And if I find anything interesting looking, maybe I'll link that into the show notes as well. But you've talked about story several times, and obviously you talk about it in the book as well. And obviously there's a lot to say about storytelling. You go through a lot of the frameworks in the book and and you talked earlier about kind of the struggles and the hero's journeys and all of that, all of those different types of framing narratives and all of the stuff that you can do to tell a good story. But one of the things I saw in the book around stories, which I found interesting, was this kind of concept of story-driven versus story-decorated presentations. I wonder if you could maybe explain a little bit the difference and maybe when the right times to use these types of narrative are.
Absolutely. I know Danielle's going to expect me because I'm the one who coined these terms. So I'm just a fanatical researcher in everything that I do. And I went through all the top TED Talks like you do, and I went and looked at a bunch of other talks. I was really obsessed with how they use story in talks. I became super interested in story back when I was writing Radical Focus because I thought, I want to write about OKRs. Oh my God, I'm writing a book about an acronym. How boring is that? How can I make it not boring? Story. Flash forward to this. I realized that all the best talks, all the ones that were viewed hundreds and hundreds of times, incorporated story, but it looked like there were two different approaches to story. So if you think about the top one, which is, oh gosh, Danielle, help me out. The name of Ken, somebody who does.
Oh, no, Ken Robinson's talk. So there's Ken Robinson's talk. Is that the one?
Yeah. Ken Robinson's talk.
I don't know the name of it.
That's okay. It's the one. So with Ken Robinson's talk, TED Talk, it's easy to find because it's the number one. He tells some jokes and then he tells this amazing story at the end, right? Where he's talking about the kid who can't sit still and they're flunking out and they're having a terrible time. And then somebody comes in and says, no, she's not a bad student. She's a dancer. She needs to be able to move. And that story is so powerful that I think most people can't even remember the rest of the story, except it means it's important to get student art education. You have Susan, The Power of Introverts, Quiet, The Power of Introverts. I can't think of her last name. God, I'm bad at names. But she talks about her research, but she has these little mini stories she drops in along the way. So again, we see this, I have something to say. Here's a bunch of mini stories to sort of decorate this message I have. But then you come into My Stroke of Insight by Jill Boyd. And oh my God, that is just one giant story. She comes on, she gives you a little background about neuroscience and her brother, but then she's going through a stroke and giving us a play-by-play of this experience of the stroke. And every second we're like, oh my God, okay, she's on stage. So clearly the ambulance gets to her, but oh my God, is the ambulance going to get to her? You're just so excited by her each struggle and watching her lose her mind. And that is story driven. The entire talk is basically one big story. And when I sat down to write Radical Focus, actually, before I wrote it, I gave a speech. I don't know if you know this, but I was going to talk about OKRs at Interaction Conference, a conference that's now defunct. And I was going to talk about OKRs. And I thought, once again, I haven't written the book yet. I just quickly put together this little story based on a couple of startups I was advising. I literally took photos of people in the conference to put on the slides for the parts. Like, would you guys pose for my story so I can have something to put on the slides? And I told this big story. And then I realized when I was running through it, I always do everything at the last minute. It's just one of my worst qualities. I realized I was about 10 minutes short. So at the very end of it, I gave the story of how I used OKRs to turn my life around after I quit Zynga. And so it was one big story driven and then a little sort of coda, little after story. And I have never had such a reaction as when I give this story driven talk. People will come to me in the bathroom and start talking to me. And I don't know what the rules are for men, but talking to each other in the bathroom is always a little weird when they're strangers. That's not how I was raised in Iowa. But people are like, oh my God, so tell me more about it. Did this really happen? Oh, how have you done? It's like, I've never had such a reaction. So I think story-driven talks are really rare. It's really stressful to stand up there and have faith that you can tell a story for 30 minutes and people will pay attention. But trust me, when you do it, it works incredibly well. So even though it's a less common approach than sort of decorating your story with some anecdotes, I think more people should think about telling that big story, because humans love a story, and especially a business conference. That's the other thing is everybody's like, oh, it's a business conference, we can't tell stories. Oh my God, people are so bored. Tell a story. People will love you for it.
You have to get a campfire in the middle of the stage and some marshmallows and a little guitar and start, going for the rustic feel as well. But if someone's then listening to this and thinking, I'm persuaded, I've never done any of this stuff before, I've never thought of doing it before, but Christina and Danielle are so inspiring that I've got to give it a go now. What's the first best step they should take down the path of becoming the superstar, kick-ass presenter that we all know they can be?
But Christina, you're going to say buy the book.
Apart from buying the book.
The answer is, of course, buy the book. That's true. The book does have a lot of advice in that area. Danielle, ABC, baby,
Yeah.
ABC.
Yeah. I think there's like a couple of first places you can start. And, I mentioned I think identifying your why is really important. We have a whole chapter of this. And I think that this is such an important, often undervalued part of public speaking is building a community of support. Because public speaking is such a vulnerable thing. We get caught up in our heads all the time thinking, is this idea good? Do people care about this? And so I think really early on, once you know that you want to speak, identifying those people that are going to support you along the way. So who are you going to tell right away to hold yourself accountable, right? So who's the first person you're going to tell, I'm going and doing this? Who are you going to bring into your process as you're trying to figure out, okay, how is this idea coming together? Getting some feedback or maybe some coaching along the way. Who's going to help you find that engagement? Who's going to be your champion to help you connect you to opportunities? So I think that that's actually a really important piece that, a lot of the times when I've spoken to people about when they bring in people to their process, it's after I've crafted everything and I'm ready to go, maybe I'll do a dry run with a couple of other people. And that's when I'll bring other people in. And really it should be as soon as you decide that you want to do it.
There's a concept in Startland, which is socializing the idea. And I think that that's exactly what we're talking about is you say, oh, I think I might give this talk. It's going to be about this. You bounce it off some people. They make some smart comments and you go have lunch with somebody else and you bounce it off them and they give you some more comments. Some people want to hide their idea as a precious little thing until it's perfect. And just, you can couch it with, just something I'm bouncing around. No big deal. Just wondering what you think. I want to add to what Danielle says is, this is me. This is my advice from what works for me. But I really like to pick something and commit to it, because if there's not a deadline, I won't do anything ever. So I like to pick a goal. Imagine I like goals. I like to pick a goal. I'm going to speak at the customer service lunch and learn, or I'm going to speak at this Mind the Product community. And I think that's a really great place to start, is pick a stage that's as safe as possible, as small as possible, and then commit to it with your accountability buddy, or commit to it by putting it in your calendar, whatever is going to work for you. But I like me a deadline.
Now, if I'm thinking about that as an approach, and again, maybe thinking back to musician days as well, there are some gigs that suck and there are some gigs that go pretty well, right? And there's a lot of goodwill, probably, as long as you picked your friends properly, your community properly. There's going to be a lot of goodwill behind the first one, but it might not be amazing because you're still trying to find your feet with some of this stuff. And that can discourage people because they sit there and they start playing this stuff back in their head, and you start worrying about every single little dropped word or stumble or whatever it is that happened during the first talk that they did. And I know it's going to be very much depend on the person as to how they recover from that. But how, I guess for both of you, how do you, or how did you recover from like your first bad talk that you thought was bad?
Yeah, when I reflected back, and it's actually something I blocked out of my head because I did not, when I first took on Women Talk Design, I was always like, nah, I haven't I've spoken kind of like informally. I don't have like a lot of stories from public speaking. And then as I like started to dig in more, because I was mining for stories for presentations that I was giving, I came back to like one of my absolute worst public speaking experiences. And I was actually a college student, but I was part of a graduate class. I was one of 7, but the only undergraduate. And I'll give you the short version of it. Essentially, I was supposed to give this really important public presentation at a conference, at a museum. We ended up doing a dry run with the whole department, art history department. And I wasn't prepared. And I hadn't given that type of presentation before. And I decided to wing it, which was a terrible idea. And a third through, I realized I didn't know what I was doing. And I didn't have the tools to calm myself down. And I just started hysterically crying in the middle of this presentation with all of the art history department there and walked out. And like, lucky for me, it was a dry run. And so I like was able then to figure out, okay, I need to put more time and prep into this. And when I actually gave the final presentation at the museum, I assume it went great. I actually don't remember it, but I think that's a good sign that like it wasn't scarring. But I think that, I don't know that like from there, I was like, it's lucky for me, I was in college. So I like still had to present, right? Like I didn't really have a choice to not present anymore. But I think one of the things that really has stood out to me now as I've done more and more speaking is that there's always going to be times that you mess up. You can't just like stop doing it. And what you can do instead is learn from that. And I have learned so many things from that. Is one, the importance of context, that I felt comfortable speaking in other contexts, but I had never done that type of presentation before. And it required a different type of preparation for me. Another is the importance of like pausing and taking a deep breath if you feel like your presentation is not going well, because I just tried to talk my way through it. And that's what really spiraled. And then the third is the importance of, like practicing and having that as a dry run. So that wasn't the final public presentation. So I think if you can, for me, learning that I can treat any presentation as a learning opportunity, I think it's just helped me going into any presentation I've done. Because afterwards I can be like, okay, these are the things I did well. And like, this is what I want to change about my next one. Christina, you got lots of stories.
I've sucked more than I would like to admit. So I think what Danielle's saying, though, is treating things like a learning experience, but it doesn't mean that it's not hellish torture, for a little while afterwards. So Danielle just referenced context, which is the C in camp, and context is really important. Like one of the elements is knowing your audience. And when I was a newly minted consultant, I just left working for other people, and I was this was late 90s, early 2000s. And I'd written this talk beyond usability testing and talking about all these cool techniques like personas and contextual research and contextual inquiry, field studies. And this was everybody where I was in San Francisco as part of the startup scene was like, whoa, dude, these are crazy audiences. And so I applied to speak at this place called, I think it was the UPA. It was basically a bunch of usability researchers and UX professionals, UX researcher professionals. And I gave this talk and everybody was in there. And afterwards they're like, we know this. What the hell? Like, this has been around forever. I don't understand why you bothered. Like, people were walking out during the talk. It was that bad. And I kept thinking, do they hate me? Am I wearing the wrong dress? What the hell? And luckily somebody was rude enough to tell me that this was a stupid talk to give here. So there was nothing wrong with the talk. It had been successful elsewhere, but context was king. And then I also have a horrible story about the game developers conference, in which my hero was sitting in the audience, and I opened up the slides, and I had gotten them from Dropbox, and they were the wrong slides. It hadn't synced, so it was like a rough skeleton of a talk, and I ended up making up the whole thing. Practically, it was like slide karaoke, and that was traumatic. But I knew my material, and that was the learning experience from that. Is like, make sure you really know your material. I'm not one for practicing, unfortunately. Danielle mocks me, but this is one of the reasons the book is like, here's a bunch of tools. You don't have to use them, but they might help. So instead of practicing, I do the thing where like I make sure I know all the stuff behind each concept, just the way I teach. And so once again, like, don't talk about something unless you've internalized it, I think is one of my learning experiences from that. Oh my God. And Stone LeBrand was in the audience. I'm like a total fan girl. And I was like, no, why in front of my hero? Why am I sucking? Oh, well, it happens. Move on.
Sad times. But yeah, no, definitely I don't have like a pre-baked story off the top of my head, but I definitely think that every time I've tried to wing it, I am a preparer personally, but like whenever I've tried to wing it, it's always gone kind of very mediocrely. So hopefully people out there will listen to this and take some tips anyway. But we talk about this stuff all day, but
not to interrupt you, but I'm going to interrupt you. That is such a good example, though, of what this book is about. Is I am a total winger. I just like, if I have everything scripted out, I've tried it. I've tried scripting it out, and I suck. If I cannot do it, I start tripping over my own words. And you're a preparer. So I think that one of the things in the book is like, figure out what works for you, you know. And I know it's a diversity of approaches. It's beyond just the diversity of the people speaking, but also the diversity of the styles and the diversity of how you think and the neurodiversity. Let's bring in some of that. And we wanted to write a book that gave you a framework and held you up without telling you who you have to be.
It's funny though, because I remember doing one talk and to this preparation point, like, you know, wanting to do like one last rehearsal. And I did one last rehearsal the morning of the presentation, probably about an hour before I was going to go on. And it was awful. Like, it was a really bad rehearsal. And then I had to immediately go and do the talk. And the talk went fine, to be fair. But like, it's just like, there is definitely a danger of over practicing, I guess. And I definitely personally don't recommend rehearsing on the morning of the talk, because if you screw up in your rehearsal, then like it kind of just sets the wrong tone. I think sometimes you just got to realize that you are where you are, and that the work you've done to this point is hopefully enough, right? But if people want to find either of you after this to chat about getting involved in Women Talk Design, find out about any of your various books that you've done between you, or just generally present themselves for a chat, where can they find you?
Everywhere, if you can spell the word name Wodtke, pretty much. I have a very unusual last name, so it's very easy to, do a quick search and find me on the LinkedIn. So I'm not on X very much because Elon Musk, but I do have a 24-year-old blog that I called eleganthack.com that's been around forever. And find me in excellent bookstores anywhere. How about that?
I'm going to give an endorsement for Elegant Hack. Christina's essays are so good. And actually, we had several of them be the basis of parts of the book. And so I would definitely recommend hanging out there. You can find the book at womentalkdesign.com/book. It is on online at bookshop.org and Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Me personally, you can find on LinkedIn. I think my LinkedIn handle is Barnes Danielle. But if you search Danielle Barnes, Women Talk Design, I'll probably come up.
I'll link it all into the show notes to make it easy for people, and hopefully you'll have a few people presenting in your general directions. Well, that's been a fantastic chat. So, Christina, obviously great to see you again and, catch up after the last time. Danielle, pleasure to meet you for the first time, and hopefully you'll come on again in the future. Hopefully we'll all stay in touch. But yeah, as for now, thanks for taking the time.
Thank you so much. This was fun.
Yeah, it was totally fun. We've never done a three-way podcast. It was a hoot.
I know. I love too Christina and I spent so much time working on this book together. So now being able to talk about it together is really awesome. So thanks for having us, Jason.